Mr. Hwan Jun-kook, Permanent Representative of the Republic of Korea, and his team for their service as President of the Council for the month of June. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted in accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure. I invite the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza pursuant to Security Council Resolution 2720, Madam Sigrid Kaag, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda, and I would now like to give the floor to Madam Sigrid Kaag.
Mr. President, Excellencies, nearly 9 months have passed since the horrific terror attack by Hamas against Israel on the 7th of October. The scars of that day run deep. The pain of the hostages, the torment for their families, is a constant reminder to the Israeli people and political life. During this same period, Palestinian civilians in Gaza have been plunged into an abyss of suffering. Their homes lie shattered, their lives upended. The war has not merely created the most profound of humanitarian crises, it has unleashed a maelstrom of human misery. The public health system, as you know, has collapsed, schools destroyed, and the disrupted education system threatens acutely future generations. With summer temperatures soaring and severe shortages of basic services such as waste management, sanitation facilities and water supplies, the spectre of outbreaks of infectious and communicable diseases looms large. Following the Israeli offenses against Rafah since the 6th of May, over 1 million people have been displaced once again, desperately seeking shelter and safety. 1.9 million people are now displaced across Gaza. I'm deeply concerned about reports of new evacuation orders issued into the area of Khan Yunis. Its impact on the civilian population is deep. In Gaza, nowhere is safe. Behind every statistic, Mr. President, is a human story of hope, dignity, and aspirations. And in my visits to Gaza, I am met with voices that echo a single heart-wrenching question: will our suffering ever end? Mr. President, it cannot be repeated often enough. We need an immediate, full and complete ceasefire in Gaza. We demand the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages and unimpeded and continuous access to deliver aid at scale throughout the Gaza Strip, in line with Security Council Resolution 2735. International humanitarian law and international human rights law must be respected by all. Protection of civilians remains the paramount priority. UNRWA must be allowed to deliver on its mandated role. Mr. President, since our last briefing, I've continued to engage with key governments and other regional stakeholders at the highest political levels. I met Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and key cabinet members again 2 weeks ago, further to Security Council Resolution 2720. The resolution establishes a framework to expedite, streamline and accelerate the delivery of humanitarian assistance throughout Gaza. As expected, this has been fraught with challenges. Yet, deliverables include the establishment of additional supply routes, the streamlining and facilitation which has taken place, whilst the space for acceleration remains very much subject to political will, as well as the enabling environment and conditions on the ground. There is no substitute for political will. In addition, the resolution mandated the establishment of a mechanism for monitoring and verification of humanitarian assistance. And the mechanism is now capturing humanitarian aid shipments from Jordan, Cyprus, Israel and the West Bank into Gaza, ensuring greater volume at certain times. I underline at certain times. Transparency and prioritization. Its establishment in a matter of months is the result of tremendous collaboration and support from UNOPS. The activation of the mechanism for supplies from Egypt is expected by mid-July. Subject to approval of their visa, UN monitors are getting ready to deploy to the mechanism's newly established offices in Gaza. and options are being discussed on the feasibility and longer-term planning of the Cyprus Maritime Corridor with continued direct access to Gaza. Finally, the mechanism will also serve as the main platform to facilitate entry into Gaza of all critical humanitarian items, consolidating existing practices further to the intent of the resolution. I encourage Member States to continue to preposition supplies and to allocate financing to humanitarian agencies. Additional contributions are urgently needed to address and meet the gap of the 2.5 billion flash appeal. As foreseen, Mr. President, by the resolution, in September this year, I will submit my last report to this Council, at which I will also share my broader observations. Mr. President, during my last briefing, I reported that on the 5th of April, the Israeli War Cabinet made several commitments with regard to Resolution 2720. My mission has been monitoring the implementation of these and other commitments, some of which are in place. These include the direct entry of humanitarian aid to Gaza from the north via Zikim and the Eretz crossings, as well as the use of the port of Ashdod. Approval for the resumption of the electricity line into the desalination facility in Khan Yunis. While the Nahal Oz water line was also opened, I note that this morning there are reports that would indicate the water line was unfortunately damaged, again in hostilities last night. Permission to enter select medical items, for instance UNFPA's maternity wards and field hospitals in northern Gaza. Further, critical communication and protective equipment, which are vital for the UN and broader humanitarian operations in Gaza, have recently been approved and transferred to Gaza, while discussions on other essential items are still ongoing. Continued use of Gate 96 to allow the entry of humanitarian supplies and fuel. We have seen an increase in the volume of commercial cargo entering Gaza, albeit irregularly, and we are in discussion to ensure commercial supplies are in line with the immediate needs of the population, meeting the humanitarian requirements. Mr. President, Prime Minister Netanyahu has made further commitments to expedite the delivery of essential supplies for water, sanitation, waste management, and medical and educational needs. Urgent action is needed. Following last week's evacuation of 21 Palestinian children with serious illnesses and their accompanying adults from Gaza to Egypt via the Kerem Shalom, Kerem Abu Salam crossing, discussions are ongoing to establish a more regular and predictable system of medical evacuations for patients, facilitated by WHO. In view of the immense need, I consider this a priority and ask for your urgent attention and support. Mr. President, in line with the resolution, a sustained flow of assistance to Gaza is needed to deliver quantity and quality of goods throughout all land and sea crossings, including the Rafah border crossing. This requires a continued focus. The ability of the UN and humanitarian partners to operate safely and securely inside Gaza is equally important in view of the ever-growing risks. Since the start of the Israeli military operation in Rafah and the subsequent closure of the Rafah border crossing in early May, the volume of aid entering into Gaza or being distributed across Gaza has dropped significantly. Military activity and the lack of safe routes inside Gaza continue to severely impact humanitarian operations. A near total breakdown of civil order has further led to an environment of lawlessness and criminality. This worrying trend further hampers the UN's ability to deliver on its mandate. Many of you will be familiar with images of supplies accumulated at Kerem Shalom, Kerem Abu Salam crossing. The UN has asked Israel to find solutions to enable this safe delivery of aid that includes its distribution. Aid that should be reaching Palestinian civilians across the Gaza Strip. Since the 26th of May, trucks from Egypt have temporarily been rerouted via Kerem Shalom, Kerem Abu Salam. To further the reopening of the Rafah border crossing, my mission has submitted proposals to the parties with regards to possible reopening of the Rafah border crossing based on options provided. Mr. President, urgent action remains required with regards to the following: the establishment of an effective, credible and predictable deconfliction and coordination system across Gaza. Discussions on this matter are currently underway, as you know. Continued access to all security and communication equipment, as well as the critical humanitarian items needed for the delivery or repair of basic services. route clearance from mines and unexploded ordnances, and the approvals urgently needed to undertake these assignments, prepositioned storage and the movement of the daily needed volume of fuel, import of spare parts and relevant maintenance equipment. And concerning the diversification of routes, as well as the sustainability of supplies, we need a further scaling up of the Jordan corridor, the expansion of volume of aid entering via Tzikim and the Erez crossings respectively, the opening of additional crossings, especially to South Gaza, and consideration of movement of aid from North to South Gaza. And last but not least, the urgent reopening of the Rafah border crossing, also with a view to the important planning for recovery and reconstruction. Mr. President, while humanitarian assistance will be required for years to come, planning and preparing for the early recovery and reconstruction of Gaza is essential. We cannot ask Palestinian civilians to put their future on hold while they'll cling to their human dignity under the most inhumane circumstances. Establishing the framework and priorities for early recovery and reconstruction is both political and technical. While politics and conditions on the ground may dictate the pace and the nature of these efforts, preparations should not wait. Let's look at what can be done now to complement and support the humanitarian response. Palestinians, young and old, in Gaza should not be asked to wait. The Palestinian Authority has a critical role to play in the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian Authority is integral to planning for the implementation of Gaza's recovery and reconstruction, and the international community must ensure the Palestinian Authority's financial stability and support its reform, governance and other capacities needed to reassume its responsibilities in Gaza. I would also like to underline that the creation of a modern local economy across the Gaza Strip should be a priority. Palestinians cannot be expected to depend on humanitarian assistance alone. Commercial activities need to grow and the private sector needs to be revitalized. The 2720 mechanism that has been established can be used to facilitate a scale-up, the acceleration and expedition of all goods needed for Gaza, needed for the early recovery and reconstruction. This is beyond the current humanitarian focus. Mr. President, ambitious reconstruction planning also requires ambitious and generous financing. This means the international community needs to consider a range of financing options and instruments, from traditional development financing to the establishment of new trust funds to tried and tested innovative financing instruments, with a view to sustaining the necessary level of investments and guarantee financing flows, including those from the private sector. But when we talk about recovery, reconstruction or financing, this can be abstract. But if we view it through the human lens, the lens of our fellow human beings, it means the following: dignified shelter, while more permanent housing is being built and or refurbished. The restoration of basic functioning health, sanitation and water systems. The urgent rehabilitation of schools or the establishment of other places of learning relevant to education. The creation of income-generating jobs, sustained and specialized mental health and psychosocial support services, support to local civil society organizations or non-governmental organizations, particularly those led by those inspiring young people or the strong women of Gaza I keep meeting on every visit. Special attention and support is needed to the estimated 17,000 children orphaned by this war alone. And to restore people's dignity and quality of life, we need to urgently extend our hand to those with disabilities, including the vast number of young and old civilians that have suffered amputations and require constant support, including the import of prostheses. Some of this work should start now, despite the conditions on the ground, and it deserves the unwavering international support. Mr. President, Resolution 2720 has achieved intended and significant progress, but there is no substitute, as I mentioned, for political will. There is no substitute for the full respect of international humanitarian law, especially when it comes to the protection of civilians, and the safe and enabling environment to secure effective distribution. Although intentions and commitments may be convincing, the only credible measure of change and progress are the improvements in the lives and well-being of Palestinian civilians in Gaza. There's a long road to travel to realize this, and much more remains to be done lest we fail the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And of course, it remains our duty to advocate for lasting peace between Israel and a fully independent, viable and sovereign Palestinian state alongside a safe and secure Israel. Mr. President, I have a last 4 lines from a Palestinian girl in Gaza given to me on one of my field visits. It's not necessarily in my style, but I would like to read it for you. I will do so, however, in Arabic. أنا فاطمة المصري.
My name is Fatima Al-Masri. I'm 8 years old. I'm from Gaza. I love my country. I love my friends. I live in a camp. I would like to live in a home, in a house like all other children.
We owe it to all children. Thank you.
I thank Madam Cog for her briefing. I will now give the floor to members of the Council who wish to take the floor. And I will start by giving the floor to Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator, Ms. Sigrid Kaag, for her detailed updates describing human misery, as she said, impacting negatively to even the future generation, with valuable observation and call for urgent action. The humanitarian situation in Gaza remains catastrophic with no end in sight. As hostilities continue, Palestinians are experiencing repeated displacement, starvation, and little to no access to essential goods and services. Every passing day of the conflict only brings more casualties, devastation, trauma, and destruction. We must do all we can do to meet the dire needs of those suffering in Gaza. In this regard, Japan welcomes the full operationalization of the UN 2720 mechanism dedicated to accelerating the delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza. While Israel's military operation continues, we are relieved to hear of the progress in the coordination and management of humanitarian assistance to Gaza. We highly value Ms. Kaag's and her team's extensive and tireless engagement with the parties and relevant stakeholders, including the government of Israel. We also commend the close cooperation by regional countries, including Cyprus, Egypt, and Jordan, as well as the US, to expand the scale of aid delivery through maximizing access routes, including the maritime and additional land corridors. At the same time, we have listened carefully to the words of Ms. Kaag, describing many persisting challenges she and her team are facing, such as insecurity and a lack of deconfliction mechanisms across Gaza and the continued closure of the Rafah crossing. Japan offers its full support to the endeavor of Ms. Kaag and the 2720 mechanism, and stands ready to work with fellow Council members to effectively implementing the mandate of the mechanism and address the remaining obstacles to humanitarian assistance. Given the vast scale and scope of the needs in Gaza, the work of the UN, including UNRWA, the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza, plays a crucial part in alleviating the suffering of the people and thus requires further financial support and other resources. For its part, since October last year, Japan has provided humanitarian aid worth more than $120 million in sectors such as food, wash, health, and medical care through a number of international organizations as well as through Japanese NGOs. We have also made extensive in-kind contributions of blankets, jerry cans, plastic sheets, and sleeping mats to UNRWA and other aid organizations. We will continue to provide necessary assistance and encourage others to provide further support as well. Ultimately, however, what is needed more than ever is the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2735, which can pave the way for the release of hostages and an immediate ceasefire leading to the safe and unimpeded distribution of humanitarian assistance throughout Gaza. Japan strongly urges Hamas to work in good faith based on Resolution 2735 without further delay. Lastly, we would like to stress that international law must be respected by all parties at all times. In particular, civilians must be protected and the safety of the UN and other humanitarian workers and premises must be ensured. We must continue to play our part in saving the lives of the innocent and work towards bringing peace and stability to the region. I thank you.
Я благодарю представителя Японии.
I thank the representative of Japan for your statement, and I now give the floor to China.
Thank you, President. I congratulate Russia on its assumption of the presidency of the Security Council for this month. The Chinese delegation will fully support you and your colleagues in your work. I also commend the Republic of Korea for completing its presidency of the Council last month. I thank Senior Coordinator Karg for her briefing. Ms. Karg's briefing demonstrates once again the unprecedented deterioration of the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza due to extreme shortages of supplies for survival and the dire health conditions. Millions of people are struggling with hunger, disease, pain, and despair. The humanitarian disaster in Gaza is human-made. The tragic scenes on the ground are serious breaches of international law and international humanitarian law. Before us, Gaza has been under blockade for 9 months, with the supply of water, electricity, food, medication, and fuel cut off, and over 2 million people living in an open-air prison in a state of precariousness and struggling to get by without food and other means of survival. Before us, the most important Rafah crossing has been forced to close for 2 months because of Israeli military operations, and thousands of trucks loaded with humanitarian supplies have to wait in long lines. The existing crossing points are far from being able to meet the demand for humanitarian aid. The huge investment in the floating dock by some country and the many twists and turns in its use once again show that land transport routes are the key to the expansion of humanitarian access at scale, and their role is irreplaceable. Before us, the entry of humanitarian supplies into Gaza has been obstructed at every level, and a large number of people have been unjustifiably denied access to the most basic necessities they urgently need for survival. Humanitarian workers are not only denied effective cooperation, but also face unreasonable difficulties and accusations. Also before us, the facilities of humanitarian agencies have become repeated targets, and the safety and security of humanitarian workers are not ensured. The facilities of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East have been repeatedly attacked, and the humanitarian agencies, such as the ICRC, have been put at risk by the fighting. The conflict has resulted in the deaths of over 200 humanitarian workers, which is unprecedented in history and shocking. Deconfliction mechanisms have been rendered ineffective, and humanitarian workers have even been denied carrying essential communication equipment such as radios. All above is just the tip of the iceberg of the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. We reiterate that hunger cannot be weaponized, humanitarian issues cannot be politicized, and the human-made exacerbation of the humanitarian disaster is unacceptable. China urges Israel to fulfill its obligations under international humanitarian law, heed the overwhelming overwhelming core of the international community take concrete actions to ensure the rapid and safe entry of humanitarian supplies at scale into Gaza and ensure the safe and orderly distribution of humanitarian supplies throughout Gaza, and cooperate fully with the United Nations and other humanitarian organizations. The Council adopted Resolution 2720 with the intent to expand at scale humanitarian access, but it has clearly not materialized. It is necessary to examine the reasons why the resolution has not been effectively implemented. We call upon the country concerned to work harder to push for political will from the party concerned to effectively remove obstacles to the at-scale entry of the humanitarian aid into Gaza. We support Senior Coordinator Karg in her continued efforts and expect her to bring about tangible progress in line with the requirements of the Council resolutions, the expectations of the international community, and the urgent needs of the people in Gaza. President, the fundamental way to alleviate the humanitarian disaster and save innocent lives lies in the immediate realization of a lasting ceasefire and the early relaunch of the two-state solution. China calls on the international community to continue to make unremitting efforts to that end. We support the Council in taking further necessary action as soon as possible. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for a statement, and I give the floor to the representative of France. Mr. President, I'd like to thank Madam Kag for her presentation. I would like to once again express the full support of France for her work and call for the complete implementation of resolutions 2712, 2720, and 2728 and 2735. The presentation by Madam Kag confirms the disastrous situation in Gaza. No glimmer of hope is on the horizon. The number of civilian victims continues inexorably to increase. The population requires aid to survive. Famine has taken hold. 80% of civilian infrastructure is damaged or destroyed, among which 95% of educational infrastructure. Thousands of children have been killed, are missing, or trapped under debris, detained or isolated. An entire generation of children has been deprived of education and will be traumatized in the long run. It is therefore essential to lift all impediments to humanitarian assistance. Assistance must be able to use all crossing points. France calls Israel to immediately open the Rafah crossing point. It calls on Israel to take all necessary measures to ensure the provision of basic services and humanitarian aid throughout Gaza. Israel must allow an immediate, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access as required by the International Court of Justice. This implies the deliverance of the necessary authorizations to all humanitarian agencies and programs, including UNRWA. I would like to thank the Special Coordinator for having established an aid coordination mechanism to ensure that merchandise that enters Gaza corresponds to the reality of needs and it reaches its beneficiaries. And while an increase in the volume of aid is necessary, it's important for the goods that are delivered to Gaza are distributed in a safe way. Numerous restrictions as far as the objects and foodstuffs can enter into Gaza remain, in particular for healthcare, water and sanitation infrastructure, and waste treatment infrastructure. It is essential for the United Nations and humanitarian actors to have access to appropriate equipment to conduct operations and prevent a deterioration in the situation. With the heat, the risk of the spread of epidemics could lead to much more civilian victims. The protection of humanitarian workers must also be guaranteed in all circumstances. This Council took up the issue again in May with Resolution 2730. This is a moral and legal imperative incumbent on all. France pays tribute to all humanitarian personnel who have been killed in Gaza. The laws of war and humanitarian principles of precaution and proportionality in conducting hostilities must be respected. We call on all actors to ensure the effectiveness of the deconfliction mechanisms. The coordinating role of the United Nations is on this point essential. Mr. President, France demands an immediate and ceasefire, as well as the release of all hostages. We condemn once again the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October of 2023. We are against the ongoing operation in Rafah, in line with the order of the International Court of Justice. Israel must immediately stop its military offensive and all other action conducted in the Rafah Governorate. France will continue to be actively involved to find a rapid solution to the crisis based on a two-state solution. We need security guarantees for Israelis. We must work on building a state for Palestinians. A reformed Palestinian Authority will have a central role to play in this process in the West Bank as well as in Gaza, and Gaza should become a part of this Palestinian state. It is urgent to act toward that, and thank you very much. I am grateful to the representative of France for your statement, and I now give the floor to Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I would like to thank the Republic of Korea for the stewardship of the presidency last month and to wish you all the best this month, Mr. President. I also thank you for organizing this briefing and express appreciation to Ms. Kag for the updates provided on her work pursuant to the mandate outlined in Resolution 2720. Her report allows us one more time to contemplate the depth of suffering which the Palestinian people continue to experience and the enormous challenges associated with alleviating their suffering, all while hope remains distant. Mr. President, Guyana has taken note of the complex operating environment in which humanitarian workers are attempting to bring relief to the ailing Palestinian population, and that aid is not reaching Palestinians at scale. It is especially concerning that humanitarian workers appear to be targeted systematically, presumably as part of a larger strategy to annihilate as many Palestinians as possible through deprivation and other means. The lack of aid at scale is attributable to, inter alia, the inadequate number of available access points into Gaza and the absence of functioning notification and deconfliction mechanisms for the safety of humanitarian workers operating in Gaza. These factors are compounded by the lack of security guarantees for civilians accessing aid and by the near total breakdown of law and order, which is affecting service providers' ability to deliver, and we have heard this from Ms. Kag as well. The result of this consistent onslaught of challenges is multidimensional, and I will highlight two of the most concerning aspects. The latest IPC report on Gaza conveyed that 96% of the population are facing acute food insecurity at crisis levels or higher, with almost 500,000 people in catastrophic conditions. Guyana has also taken note that at least 557,000 women in Gaza are facing severe food insecurity, with mothers and adult women in a more precarious situation, since they often prioritize feeding others and report greater difficulty in accessing food compared to men. It has been observed that when humanitarian access has improved, it has contributed to modest improvements in food security indicators and improvements in the diets of children. This reinforces the critical link between sufficient access and improvements in the humanitarian situation. The collapse of the health system, as pointed out by Ms. Kag, is another appalling consequence of concern. According to the World Health Organization, evacuation orders, deteriorating security conditions, and population displacement are affecting healthcare provision. Fuel shortages and shortages of medicines and health supplies in Gaza Strip hospitals are hindering the delivery of life-saving medical care. Together with the unavailability of water, sanitation and hygiene services, these circumstances have led to, inter alia, a rise in infectious diseases and deaths due to simple injuries and chronic diseases. Mr. President, against this background, Guyana reiterates 3 important calls. First, there must be increased humanitarian access into Gaza. The number of crossings into Gaza is too limited, thus hindering the supply of humanitarian aid. In keeping with its international legal obligations, Israel must facilitate this. Guyana recalls the orders issued by the International Court of Justice on 26th of January, 28th of March, and 24th May. We recall in particular that the court stated in its May order that, and I quote, "Unhindered provision at scale by all concerned of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance necessitates that Israel maintain open land crossing points, and in particular the Rafah crossing," end of quote. While Guyana supports efforts to scale up humanitarian assistance by all means, we stress that there is no substitute for land crossings. Guyana therefore supports the work of the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza to this end. Second, Guyana calls on the parties to ensure the safety of humanitarian personnel operating in Gaza. An unprecedented number of humanitarian workers have been casualties of this war. This is principally due to non-compliance with international humanitarian law, which dictates the proper functioning of deconfliction and notification mechanisms to facilitate the safe movement of humanitarian workers. Guyana recalls the recent adoption by this Council of Resolution 2730 on the security of humanitarian and UN personnel and calls on the parties to fully comply with the provisions of this resolution. Third, Guyana demands an immediate ceasefire and an end to this war, which has claimed the lives of nearly 40,000 civilians in the Gaza Strip. After nearly 9 months of unrelenting war, the devastation is catastrophic and grows worse every day. This must stop, and Palestinians must be able to rebuild their lives. This is a critical factor. Further, the international community must facilitate the rebuilding of Gaza. This is a critical factor in advancing the two-state solution. To this end, Guyana recognizes and supports the mandate of Ms. Kag, as outlined in Resolution 2720. We stress the importance of cooperation from all parties for the successful implementation of this resolution. We also stress UNRWA's critical role in any reconstruction effort in Gaza, owing to its decades of experience providing services to Palestinians in the territory. Mr. President, in closing, this Council must never get accustomed or immune to the reports of pain and suffering of the Palestinian people, especially when news cycles move on to different issues and the eyes on the Council gaze elsewhere. Our hunger to act must never diminish. I therefore conclude by reiterating Guyana's commitment to working with this Council to bring this war to a swift end so that civilians can experience relief and the reconstruction of Gaza can commence in earnest. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank the Undersecretary General and the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, Ms. Sigrid Kaag, for her briefing. What struck me was the need to ensure human dignity, but also to take concrete action to address everything from children's education to reconstruction. Since the adoption of Resolution 2720 in December of last year, you, Ms. Kaag, and your team have made every effort to expedite the delivery of aid to the civilian population. Nonetheless, we continue to face a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, and it's difficult to even describe it. 9 months since the acts of terror were committed on the 7th of October, which Switzerland strongly condemned, we remain deeply disquieted by the conflict in the Middle East, in particular, the appalling humanitarian situation in Gaza. We condemn the fact that the hostilities continue to claim many civilian lives, particularly children. There are also 1.7 million displaced persons in the Gaza Strip. The new Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Report confirms this very bleak picture. Roughly 95% of the Gaza Strip's population is facing heightened levels of acute food insecurity. 15% of the population are at the highest level, that is, at a catastrophic level. And the trend is only likely to get worse. The high risk of famine will persist as long as the conflict continues and humanitarian access is hampered. Switzerland calls on all of the parties to painstakingly observe their obligations under international law, in particular international humanitarian law and human rights law. International humanitarian law compels the parties to allow and to facilitate humanitarian access to civilians in need. It also prohibits the use of starvation as a method of warfare. Civilians must have access to essential goods and services, such as drinking water, food, and security. The International Court of Justice reaffirmed in its orders the urgency of delivering humanitarian aid to the entire Gaza Strip, and yet the level of assistance remains clearly and vastly insufficient in the face of the immense needs we're seeing. As the Special Coordinator pointed out, safe, rapid, and unfettered access throughout all crossing points remains a major challenge. This must change. It's a matter of urgency. Sufficient assistance must reach those who need it. The parties to the conflict, as well as other stakeholders, must take action. We should like to thank Jordan, Egypt, and the UN for convening at the start of this month in Amman a conference on emergency humanitarian assistance to Gaza. This sent a strong political signal. On this occasion, as well as at Council meetings, Switzerland has reiterated its pressing call for an immediate ceasefire and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Switzerland also demands that the parties respect their obligations under international law with regards to the persons they are detaining. All of these persons must be able to receive ICRC visits, and they must also be treated in a humane fashion. Switzerland calls for the full implementation of relevant resolutions adopted by the SC, specifically resolutions 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735. What's more is, as reaffirmed by Resolution 2730, submitted by Switzerland, all parties to the conflict are duty-bound to respect and protect humanitarian personnel, United Nations personnel, and other associated personnel, as well as their premises and their property. President, we all know full well that increasing humanitarian aid volumes alone is not a lasting solution to the conflict in the Middle East. What we need is a cessation of hostilities. We must urgently re-establish a political horizon. We therefore would like to reaffirm our unswerving support for the two-state solution. Only two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, of which Gaza is an integral part, living side by side in peace and security within secure and recognized borders, will bring peace, security, and dignity to the people in the region. Thank you. I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Sierra Leone congratulates and expresses full support to the Russian Federation on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for this month of July. We also commend and congratulate the Republic of Korea for their successful presidency in June. I thank the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, Ms. Sigrid, for sharing her assessment of the humanitarian situation in Gaza and her efforts to implement Resolution 2720. The humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip remains a high priority, especially with regard to addressing the critical security and administrative challenges that threaten the full implementation of SCR 2720 and all other relevant resolutions of the Council on this issue. In the past 8 months, Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have experienced a devastating war with catastrophic consequences, ranging from a massive death toll, injuries, multiple displacements, inadequate shelter, shortage of water, sanitation facilities, medication, and other daily essential products to food insecurity and famine. This cannot be normalized. and we must refuse to normalize this human tragedy of epic proportions. The plight of women and children have been particularly devastating, as they still struggle to access the right quantity and quality of aid. As we have heard from Ms. Kagg's briefing, the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has recently reported that essential sexual and reproductive health services in Gaza are severely limited, as only a few hospitals remain partially operational following multiple attacks on healthcare facilities. A similar absence of specialized healthcare facilities for children remains a key concern. For months, heightened tensions and insecurity have continued to hinder the operations of aid agencies and the unimpeded flow of humanitarian assistance throughout the Palestinian territory. The continuous escalation of the conflict has impacted the ability of these agencies to work effectively and provide life-saving assistance to civilians, despite their best efforts. Furthermore, as reported by OCHA, over 193 UN personnel have been killed during the conflict, as well as other humanitarian workers. In support of the United Nations' effort to address the challenges of effective humanitarian support in the Gaza Strip, Sierra Leone would like to emphasize the following 2 points. Firstly, we reiterate our support for the Office of the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator and recognize our efforts through meaningful engagement and consultations with relevant stakeholders to enhance facilitation, improve coordination, monitoring and verification of all relief consignments to Gaza. We welcome our recent visits to the north of Gaza and our discussion with the Israeli authorities to advance this mandate. In this regard, we believe that ongoing discussions with the Israeli government and the wider engagement aim at resolving the prolonged conflict between Israel and Palestine should prioritize the issue of unimpeded provision of and access to humanitarian aid and essential services, which are so desperately needed in the Gaza Strip and in the occupied Palestinian territories. We also therefore welcome the convening of the high-level conference on call for action urgent humanitarian aid for Gaza, held in Jordan on 11th June. Secondly, we reiterate our call on the parties to the conflict to strictly adhere to the obligations under international law, in particular international humanitarian law, and all relevant resolutions of this Council and the binding provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice aim at protecting civilians, including humanitarian workers and civilian infrastructure. An effective deconfliction mechanism is necessary to guarantee the safety and security of all humanitarian personnel and allow for the rapid facilitation of humanitarian relief. We welcome the operationalization of the UN mechanism and improve access in the north through the Erez West crossing. However, we note the constraints UNRWA and other partners encounter on the ground to store, transport, and distribute aid to South and Central Gaza. We call for access to be granted via all possible routes into the Gaza Strip and to reduce such obstacles and for improvement in delays and restrictions from checkpoint procedures and clearance for aid. We are of the view that an immediate and sustained truce leading to a cessation of hostilities will significantly improve the humanitarian situation on the ground. We echo the words of the UN Secretary General, and I quote, "It is high time for ceasefire along the unconditional release of hostages," end of quote, urging for the current opportunity created by the recent peace initiative to be seized. In closing, Mr. President, Sierra Leone calls for continued support for the mandates of the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator, working collaboratively to improve the lives of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. We call for stronger collaboration and coordination with other UN agencies and consultants. Ultimately, adherence to the calls for an immediate ceasefire will go a long way in securing a deal that will finally end the current cycle of violence and suffering. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Thank you, Mr. President. Since this is the first meeting of the Council this month, I would like to echo the congratulations to the Republic of Korea for the excellent work that was done last month. I also want to express the best wishes to the Russian Federation during its presidency during this month of July, during which you can count on our full support. At the start of this intervention, I'd like to thank Madam Sigrid Kaag, Senior Coordinator for Humanitarian and Reconstruction Affairs of the United Nations in Gaza, for her presentation, and I would like to reiterate the support of my country for her efforts. Slightly more than 2 months ago, in the last report on the implementation of Resolution 2720, I recalled that since the beginning of the war in Gaza last October, my country has on many occasions stated that the civilian population of Gaza must have access to humanitarian assistance in sufficient quantities in a continual and predictable way. Today, in spite of the efforts undertaken by the senior coordinator, her team, and other actors, it has not been possible to achieve the delivery of humanitarian aid in an unimpeded way and at scale to ensure access of the population of Gaza to food, water, sanitation, electricity, telecommunications, and medical services that are essential for its survival. The humanitarian efforts continue to be affected by restrictions. The military operations in Rafah have affected the entry of aid, which already was inadequate. The distribution continues to be a complicated task and an extremely dangerous one. In the meantime, living conditions are getting worse and the risk of famine is not diminishing. Mr. President, Ecuador commends the efforts undertaken to operationalize the 2720 mechanism and encourages in persisting in this task in spite of problems and challenges faced. These problems and challenges are due to the lack of political will. As stated by Coordinator Kaag last April, a change of paradigm is necessary, sustained by political will. Without political will, it will not be possible to increase the quality and quantity of aid or the adoption of measures that allow for its safe and unimpeded distribution inside Gaza, nor the planning and preparation for early recovery and reconstruction. My country calls on all parties to remember that Resolution 2720 demands that the parties to the conflict cooperate with Coordinator Kaag without delay or obstruction, and to demonstrate their political will in this and in all other aspects of the conflict. To conclude, Mr. President, I would like to reiterate the condemnation by Ecuador of the terrorist actions of Hamas on the 7th of October of last year and all acts of violence against civilians, and I insist on demanding both the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as well as the cessation of hostilities in compliance with the resolutions of this Council. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, Mozambique wishes to begin by warmly congratulating you and your country, the Russian Federation, for the assumption of the important post of President of the Security Council in the current month of July. We wish to assure you our fullest cooperation. We commend the Republic of Korea for the most successful presidency of the Security Council in June. We thank the Russian Federation presidency for convening this important briefing on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. We extend our profound gratitude to Ms. Sigrid Kaag, Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, for our insightful and very moving briefing on the situation in Gaza, particularly on the compliance with the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2720 of 22nd of December 2023. Mr. President, by adopting Resolution 2720, 3 months after the outbreak of the crisis in the Gaza Strip, this Council took an important step. We were moved by the determination to address effectively the catastrophic humanitarian situation that befell the Gaza Strip and the Palestinian people. Through this resolution, important mechanisms were envisaged and established in order to allow for the humanitarian response to the crisis, having in mind the full respect for human dignity of the Palestinian people. 6 months have elapsed since the adoption of the said resolution. From the report we have just heard, the stated goals of the resolution are far from being achieved as we meet today here in the Council. On the contrary, we are witnessing death on a daily basis and on a large scale in Gaza. Hostages, on the other hand, have not yet been released, and humanitarian assistance has not reached the millions of Gazans in need. We are deeply convinced that there are no plausible reasons for the current unjustified and unbearable suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza. We demand that the humanitarian catastrophe come immediately to a halt. As Council members, we are duty-bound to continue addressing the situation in Gaza as a matter of urgency. Mozambique commends the efforts of the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, as well as the tireless work conducted by our team to ensure the implementation of this important resolution. We strongly encourage the engagement with the relevant parties, the international community as a whole, in the implementation of resolutions, other resolutions, 2712, 2720, and even the spirit of resolution 2728. We hold the view that this Council must stand united in its support for the work of Ms. Sigrid Kaag, our team, and other stakeholders with a view to addressing the current humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The humanitarian efforts in Gaza require a solid ceasefire. In parallel, efforts must be made for the release of hostages, for full humanitarian access and assistance, for dialogue, for peace, for the reconstruction of Gaza, as well as for the implementation of a two-state solution leading to a peaceful coexistence between Palestine and Israel, living side by side within secure and internationally recognized borders. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President, and I also thank Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator Ms. Kaag for her briefing and her efforts. Resolution 2720 sought to address the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. It is gravely alarming that 9 months into the conflict, the conditions in the Strip remain dire and continue to deteriorate. Since 7 October, more than 37,000 people have been killed as a result of the Israeli military operation, with countless others wounded. 75% of the Gazan population has been internally displaced, and the majority on more than one occasion. Nearly the entire population is facing high levels of food insecurity, with concerning reports detailing the use of starvation as a method of warfare. Children continue to bear the brunt of this war. Israel's continued and expansive military operation into Rafah has further compounded existing risks for civilians and debilitated the humanitarian response. This includes through the seizure of the vital Rafah crossing, which remains inoperative. The implementation of the relevant Council resolutions and the full, immediate, and effective implementation of the orders of the ICJ remains essential. The obligation to ensure the unimpeded and safe delivery of humanitarian aid into and throughout Gaza, including through the lifting of all barriers to the provision of humanitarian assistance on a large scale, remains paramount. We are encouraged to note from Senior Coordinator Skach's briefing that the 2720 mechanism is now operational and contributing to improving coordinated efforts for aid delivery into Gaza. We maintain that land routes remain the most feasible and effective way to ensure that unprecedented levels of aid now enter the Strip. It is troubling that fuel shortages issues persist, hindering aid operations and the function of critical civilian facilities such as water, health and sanitation, increasing risks of communicable diseases in rising summer temperatures. Commercial goods must also be prioritized, as the people of Gaza cannot depend on aid alone. Furthermore, Malta is deeply concerned at reports of increased challenges for aid distribution within Gaza due to rising insecurities, including lawlessness, criminality, and looting. This deterioration on the ground places significant strain on the UN and its partners in continuing their respective relief efforts. As demanded for in Resolution 2720 and in accordance with international humanitarian law, United Nations and humanitarian personnel must have robust assurances for their safety and security. Last week's killing of an MSF staffer is another tragic demonstration of the high price humanitarians and health workers continue to pay with impunity. All parties must fully respect and utilize the deconfliction mechanism. Independent investigations into all killings of UN and humanitarian staff must also be held. Furthermore, the work of the UN must not be politicized. UNRWA is an irreplaceable actor, without which there can be no meaningful comprehensive aid operation into Gaza. It is operating under extremely difficult conditions, and it is crucial that the international community ensures that the agency receives the required funding and support. President, as we sit in another meeting on the situation in Gaza, we cannot risk normalizing the state of affairs. This persistent despair cannot become the inherent status quo for the Palestinian civilians and the hostages that are still being held captive by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. On this note, we reiterate our call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Malta reiterates its call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. We urge both Hamas and Israel to accept the terms of the proposal outlined in Resolution 2735 and to put an end to further human suffering. This is the only way to allow for significant flooding of aid into and across Gaza. It would also allow the space for a massive recovery and reconstruction efforts that are necessary. Crucially, a ceasefire will bring us a step closer towards a vital political horizon. It is a fundamental requirement for the realization of the two-state solution and lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I congratulate you on your assumption of the Security Council presidency for July, and I wish you every success in your duties. I also thank Mrs. Sigrid Kaag for her briefing. After 9 months of brutal killing machine being launched against the defenseless population in Gaza, the humanitarian situation is catastrophic. World Food Programme Executive Director Cindy McCain stated, and I quote, "People in Gaza are starving to death. Right now, people in Gaza are starving to death right now. The speed at which this man-made hunger and malnutrition crisis has ripped through Gaza is terrifying." And she added, "There is a very small window left to prevent an outright famine. And to do that, we need an immediate and full access to the north of the Gaza Strip. If we wait until famine has been officially declared, it will be too late. Thousand more will be dead." End of quote. Mr. President, last December, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2720 to establish a mechanism aiming at facilitate and simplify the procedure delivering humanitarian aid to Gaza, a mechanism that was presented as a solution to the obstacle imposed by the Israeli occupying administration. So, what is the situation today? A quick look at the latest UN statistic shows an undisputed conclusion. Resolution 2720 has proven ineffective. When this resolution was adopted, about 100 trucks entered Gaza daily. Before the 7th of October, there were 500. Today, the same problems remain, despite the effort of Mrs. Kaag. And humanitarian actors continue to face numerous difficulties in accessing Gaza. According to the ICP, extremely limited humanitarian access to and within the Gaza Strip continue to impede the safe and equitable delivery of life-saving, multi-sector humanitarian assistance, critical for famine prevention and response. These include severe limitation to the supply of goods, spare parts, as well as basic services. Last June, the access rate did not exceed 73 trucks per day. This small number is the result of the Israeli occupiers' deliberate policy of using starvation as a means of war. Yes, How can we justify the destruction and burning of the Rafah crossing, which is now out of service? How can we justify all the bureaucratic obstacles the occupation administration impose on humanitarian access? Image of more than 1,200 trucks lined up on the Egyptian side of the Palestinian border demonstrate the deterrent and complex administrative processes. The rate of trucks entry increased to 170 per day in April, proving that the smooth entry of aid is linked only to international pressure and, unfortunately, to the occupiers' willingness. We have repeatedly stated that the food crisis in Gaza is man-made. It's not the result of the failure of the international community or the UN mechanisms. It is due to the occupiers' policy of using starvation as a means of its dirty war against the Palestinians. Mr. President, today, distribution of humanitarian aid remains a major concern. UNRWA, the backbone of humanitarian action in Gaza, is prevented to operate throughout the Gaza Strip. It is unacceptable that even the OIOS report and Madame Colonna's report, UNRWA continues to be subject to attacks. We noticed that UNRWA was almost absent from the briefing we have heard today. Also, no provision related to its role in the effort of distribution and reconstruction in Gaza was mentioned. In this regard, a legitimate question should be asked on the plans for this agency, whose mandate is vital for the Palestinian people. For us, UNRWA is irrepressible, and the choice of NGOs to take on its task has proven ineffective. Furthermore, security issues related to distribution are to be expected. The Israeli occupying force systematically attacks the police, the Palestinian local police, during aid deliveries. And today, no one takes the risk of escorting aid convoys because they will be targeted by the occupying power. This is part of a policy, a deliberate policy aimed at destroying civil order and pushing Gazans out of their homeland. Mr. President, while we debate the number of trucks entering Gaza and how to compel the Israeli occupier to respect its obligation under international humanitarian law, people in Gaza are starving to death. This is the worst situation even documented. No one in Gaza is in food security. Yes, no one. The impact of blocking humanitarian aid from entering Gaza is seen in videos on social media that show people eating tree leaves, with some reports saying leaves have become a commodity, not for livestock, but for people to feed on. The consequences of blocking aid are shown in the faces of all the people in Gaza, 2.2 million people who are suffering from famine, as reported by the ICP Integrated Food Security Phase Classification. Mr. President and dear colleagues, in conclusion, we wonder if we in the Security Council will be able to really impose a solution that will put an end to the suffering of the Palestinians. The life of Palestinians in Gaza are threatened by hunger and disease. Without urgent action, the world will witness a humanitarian tragedy that will be written in the dark pages of history. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement, and I now give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senior Coordinator COG, for your briefing and for the continued work and dedication of your team to alleviating the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. The UN's humanitarian response capabilities and leadership are essential. The IPC recently projected that 96% of Gaza's population, more than 2 million people, will likely experience crisis, emergency, or catastrophic levels of food insecurity between now and the end of September. With much of Gaza's population facing catastrophic levels of hunger, the situation is at risk of worsening rapidly, especially with sustained disruptions in aid flows. We have consistently conveyed to Israel's senior leadership the need to provide sustained and unhindered access for humanitarian assistance to enter via all routes into Gaza. Expanding and accelerating humanitarian imports at Ashdod and opening all existing land crossings into Gaza, including at Rafah, are vital steps. Relatedly, we appreciate Coordinator COG's update on efforts to distribute aid within Gaza so that it will reach the most vulnerable, including mothers and children. In this regard, we welcome Israel's commitment to fulfill specific UN requests and continue constructive conversations with UN officials on how to best meet the further needs of UN agencies and facilitate their work. In order for humanitarian organizations to be able to safely continue their life-saving work, the IDF must implement concrete commitments to protect humanitarians and improve the overall security environment inside Gaza. We reiterate that the lack of an effective deconfliction mechanism nearly 9 months into the conflict is unacceptable and continues to put humanitarian actors at tremendous risk. Colleagues, while we continue to press Israel to improve humanitarian access, we know that the best way to address the crisis is for Hamas to accept the ceasefire proposal endorsed by this Council in Resolution 2735. Doing so would create conditions to support a massive surge of relief for Palestinians, together with taking steps to restore essential services and start early recovery efforts in Gaza. If the operating conditions improve, the humanitarian community can then provide life-saving assistance to the most vulnerable, including the many unaccompanied and separated children, pregnant women, the elderly, and the many, many families who are going hungry and dying from preventable infections and disease. A ceasefire would also allow for increased commercial activity in Gaza, getting needed supplies to people and markets. Unfortunately, Hamas has ignored the calls from this council and across the international community, coming back with new demands outside of the framework outlined by Resolution 2735. We continue to work with Israel, Egypt, and Qatar to try and bridge the gaps, and as we heard this week, Israel remains on board. We urge all council members to continue to press Hamas to accept this deal without delay or conditions and to bring about the ceasefire with a release of hostages. At the same time, the United States remains committed to providing humanitarian aid as well as to sustaining humanitarian access. In June, we announced an additional $404 million in life-saving humanitarian aid to support Palestinian civilians in Gaza, the West Bank, and the region to provide food, safe drinking water, health care, and protection. We also stand ready to continue supporting Senior Coordinator Cog's efforts and would urge others on the Council to do so as well. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for your statement, and I give the floor to Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Senior Coordinator Cog for her briefing today. Mr. President, we are deeply disturbed by the findings of the IPC report issued last week and mentioned a few times today already. It emphasized that nearly the entire population of Gaza, around 96%, is facing acute food shortages. A high risk of famine persists across the Strip. In spite of forest solutions, in spite of the ICJ order, in spite of this mechanism, in spite of all briefings and commitments, the humanitarian situation is not getting better. The needs are on the rise, and the humanitarian operational environment is collapsing. Diseases are spreading, public order has crumbled, criminal gangs are taking over, the social fabric is disintegrating. We have no right to be surprised. Starvation and famine in Gaza is man-made. We agree here with Algeria. It is a choice by Hamas, who is willingly sacrificing its people rather than agreeing to a ceasefire as defined by our resolution. A choice by Israel not to fulfill its prime duty as the occupying power. Israel is obliged to ensure food and medical supplies for the population it occupies, not just allow the passage of aid. Why Israel is not complying with the Geneva Conventions, with the Council resolutions, nor with the ICJ's order, we fail to comprehend. We underline that using starvation as the method of warfare is prohibited under international law and can amount to a war crime. We have heard from Israel that there is no limit to aid reaching Gaza. We find it hard to believe. Verified and trustworthy reports about hunger and the dire needs of Gaza's civilian population have been reaching us for months. If there is no limit to the aid reaching Gaza, why do 50,000 children require treatment for acute malnutrition? Mr. President, we condemn the continuation of attacks on humanitarian workers and UN humanitarian premises and convoys, including UNRWA, ICRC, and others. Some have halted their operations out of concern for the lives of their staff. Over 270 humanitarian workers have been killed in Gaza. Others are facing a multitude of operational challenges and obstacles. We repeat our call for the implementation of all measures to ensure the safety and security of humanitarian workers. This includes a fully functioning deconfliction mechanism, as well as delivering on other commitments made, such as tactical pauses. We also repeat our call for the immediate release of all hostages and for granting unrestricted ICRC access to them. Holding them in Hamas tunnels for the past 9 months is simply inhumane. We commend sustained efforts by Jordan and Egypt and other countries to de-escalate the crisis and for convening humanitarian conference in Amman on June 11. Mrs. Kak, we highly appreciate your efforts and the efforts of your team. We value your high-level contacts and advocacy work to keep the world's attention on this humanitarian crisis. We believe the start of the work of the mechanism can provide us, humanitarian organizations and donors, an overview and analysis of the aid reaching and being distributed in Gaza. Yet the main goal of accelerating the safe delivery of aid to every corner of Gaza is not in sight. We are missing the main ingredient for the mechanism's success, which is a ceasefire. Mr. President, the end of bombing and ceasefire will not magically solve problems for civilians in Gaza. It will be only the beginning of the end of their suffering. It will not automatically lead to sustained and unhindered humanitarian access and neither reduce the risk of famine. It will not automatically restore public order and neither open doors to reconstruction. It will not automatically enable a political process leading to the two-state solution and neither ensure that a human tragedy of epic proportions, as described by my neighbor from Sierra Leone, happens never again. So, dear colleagues, we agree with France that it is time, that it is urgent for the Security Council to start reflecting on Gaza beyond the ceasefire, even if today this seems so far away. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement. I give the floor to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me take this opportunity to express our sincere gratitude to all Council members for their kind support during ROK presidency last month. And we congratulate the Russian Federation on assuming the July presidency and wish you all the best for this month. I thank Senior Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for her detailed and insightful briefing. The Republic of Korea would like to express sincere appreciation and support for Ms. Kaag and her team, as well as the relevant countries for the efforts to advance the humanitarian mechanism under Resolution 2720. We welcome the improvements made to the process of humanitarian assistance detailed by Ms. Kaag, including expediting the entry process of humanitarian cargo and activating some land and maritime corridors into Gaza. We hope that the 2720 mechanism can keep contributing to effective monitoring and tracking of humanitarian assistance as well as commercial goods. However, we are deeply worried that even with the launching of the 2720 mechanism in May, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is still deteriorating, particularly since Israel commenced military operations in Rafah in May. 1.1 million Palestinians are experiencing catastrophic food insecurity, and 67% of Gaza's water and sanitation systems have been destroyed as heat and dehydration surge. It is highly troublesome that, as the Secretary General described last week, total lawlessness in Gaza is making the delivery of aid to those in need impossible. Tangible steps to end this tragedy must be implemented. First, we stress that under international law, it is the obligation of the occupying power, Israel, not the United Nations or NGOs, to restore and ensure public order and safety in Gaza. When aid cannot be delivered to civilians, the number of trucks crossing the border into Gaza is meaningless beyond mere statistics. Second, humanitarian goods should be prioritized over commercial ones. Of course, humanitarian assistance alone cannot meet the needs of the 2.3 million civilians in Gaza. That is why we have called for the entry of commercial goods into Gaza, which commenced 2 months ago. However, permissions for commercial goods should not lead to a decrease in the humanitarian cargo entering Gaza. Considering the economic collapse due to the ongoing hostilities, rapid and safe delivery of essential humanitarian aid should be assured and prioritized, especially for the most vulnerable people who have limited access to commercial goods. Third, Israel should do more to protect humanitarian workers. Too many aid workers, including 193 UNRWA staff members, have been killed. Improved notification and a more effective deconfliction mechanism should be implemented. Coordination meetings between the IDF and humanitarian agencies should function as an effective platform to share all relevant information and prevent any security incidents. Resolution 2730 on the protection of humanitarian personnel and civilians should be faithfully implemented. Fourth, all land crossings leading to every corner of the Gaza Strip must be opened. This will not only increase the volume of aid into Gaza, but also shorten the distance between the entry and distribution points. Opening the Rafah crossing is vital, as it is not only a crucial humanitarian entry point, but also the main entry and exit point for people in Gaza, especially those in need of medical treatment. To ensure all of these requirements, an immediate ceasefire, along with the release of all hostages, is urgently needed. People all around the world are eagerly watching to see the agreement detailed in Resolution 2735 be finalized. Therefore, diplomatic efforts should continue, and all parties, notably Hamas, must accept the conditions of the deal without further delay. Then, based on the ceasefire, reconstruction, which is another key mandate of the senior coordinator, needs to begin, and the negotiations towards the vision of the two-state solution should follow. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. At the outset of the Russian presidency, let me put on record the UK's strong view that all Council members, particularly permanent members, and even more so the Presidency of the Council, have a responsibility to uphold the principles of the Charter. We deplore the fact that Russia is shamefully failing to do that in Ukraine. I'd like to start by joining others in thanking the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for your important work to alleviate the suffering of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, including the focus on women and children. They're still suffering a devastating and deteriorating humanitarian crisis. Too many people have died. We reiterate our strong condemnation of Hamas' 7 October attacks, and we call for the immediate release of all the remaining hostages and the return of all those who have died in captivity. We are appalled by reports of sexual violence and abuse. The UK stands firm in its condemnation of these heinous acts. A negotiated pause in the fighting that leads to a sustainable ceasefire is the best way both to secure the release of the hostages and to enable the major and essential scaling up of humanitarian aid. There is now a deal on the table, endorsed by this Council, to achieve these goals. The onus is now on Hamas to accept it. We also continue to call on Israel to fulfill its commitments to increase the amount of aid getting into Gaza and to meet its obligations to facilitate unhindered humanitarian access. The findings of the IPC famine risk assessment demonstrate that not enough aid is getting into Gaza and reaching those in need. We also call for the immediate reopening of the Rafah crossing to scale up aid through all other crossing points. Distribution of aid within Gaza also needs to improve. A guaranteed and functioning deconfliction mechanism is critical to this. We call on Israel to support the minimum operating requirements of the UN agencies by providing timely approval of visas and allowing entry of armoured vehicles and personal protective equipment. President, Resolution 2720 provides for a mechanism which will show whether aid is reaching those who need it. I thank Senior Coordinator Karg and her team for their work to establish this mechanism and urge her to continue her efforts to ensure it can deliver this in a comprehensive and timely way. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I will now deliver a statement in my capacity as the representative of the Russian Federation.
My statement, I just wanted to say that we took note on the disclaimer by the UK in the beginning of its statement. Also, for the record, we would like to know that it is not for UK to teach and lecture member states, members of the Security Council, including permanent ones, on upholding international law. The law, international law, which UK and other Western partners long parted for the sake of the rules-based international order. The country that ignited, the country that fueled the conflict when it was about to be stopped in April 22. And that was exactly your Prime Minister who prevented concluding a treaty, a negotiated treaty between Russia and Ukraine that would allow for the conflict to stop at that time and to save numerous lives of unfortunate Ukrainians. Благодарим старшего координатора.
We'd like to thank the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, Ms. Sigrid Kaag, for her briefing regarding the situation in the enclave and her efforts directed to achieving humanitarian access to the territory of the enclave as per UN Security Council Resolution 2720. Based on the report that was presented today, it's become perfectly, definitively clear that against the backdrop of the IDF military operation that's been going on for almost 9 months now, with comprehensive support from Washington, a sustainable and adequate provision of the necessary assistance to the people of Gaza is simply impossible. The situation on the ground is not only deteriorating, it's putting Gazans on the brink of starvation. And that's not a figure of speech, that's the tragic reality. And this has been clearly pointed out by the WFP, which attested to the fact that 96% of Gazans, that's 2 million people, are in need of food assistance. Almost 500,000 people are already suffering from famine. They're at the highest level of the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, Category 5. As a result of the ongoing military operation and Israel's military raids, the number of deaths now exceeds 38,000, mostly women and children. Over 87,000 have been injured. Tens of thousands are missing. And there's the almost complete destruction of civilian infrastructure as well, including hospitals, schools, and residential buildings. The situation is most dire in Rafah, where since the start of the Israeli operation, which Security Council members unequivocally opposed, there were over 1.5 million refugees. These people are yet again being forced to flee wherever they could. Such actions on the part of the occupying power cannot be justified on any grounds whatsoever. Given the total absence of security, it's very difficult to talk about the effectiveness of the work being done by humanitarian organizations. OCHA is promoting a system of deconfliction and humanitarian notifications, but that system is not working. That's a fact. On the 13th of May, a UN DSS staffer died. A second DSS staffer was wounded. This was a result of a UN vehicle being struck. The Israelis said they would investigate, yet we know nothing about the results of that investigation. Perhaps the representatives of the UN could shed some light on the matter and perhaps give an answer to that question. Since the start of the crisis, 274 humanitarian workers have died. Of them, 197 are UN personnel. The majority, 193, are UNRWA staff. We've also had reports of 500 health workers being killed. No matter how carefully Ms. Karg chooses her words to describe her engagement with the parties to the conflict and to describe the special humanitarian mechanism for Gaza, which was established as per UNCR 2720, the reality is that humanitarian access is not being ensured. The main channels for the delivery of assistance are very much limited, and when they do open up, it's for a short period of time with the blessing of the Israeli authorities. When they do open, their handling capacity is insufficient to properly meet the needs of the civilian population. UNRWA Commissioner General, Mr. Lazzarini, stated that even after the IDF announced tactical pauses of military hostilities along humanitarian assistance delivery routes, nothing changed on the ground. We're seriously disquieted by the latest reports by the Ministry of Health in the Gaza Strip regarding the fact that the fuel required to run hospitals will run out in a matter of 48 hours. We must understand that what stands behind these numbers are the lives of patients who are very sick. It goes without saying that Ms. Karg cannot be blamed for this. Since the outset, it was clear that when intense military hostilities are ongoing, ensuring safe and sustainable humanitarian access to those in need is impossible. We said this on many occasions, and we therefore called for a ceasefire as well. We want to make it crystal clear. We commend the efforts of humanitarian organizations and note the valor of humanitarian workers who are putting their lives on the line as they continue to work and provide assistance to the Palestinians. We believe that any assistance, even if the volumes are insignificant, is highly important and can save lives, or at least, at a minimum, alleviate suffering. We must continue working with the Palestinian and Israeli sides to seek humanitarian assistance delivery options. Having said that, Ms. Karg, her team, OCHA, and humanitarian organizations in general need to soberly assess the situation on the ground and correctly set priorities for their humanitarian efforts. For example, it's high time to recognize that the maritime corridor between Cyprus and the Gaza Strip and the U.S.-built temporary pier near the enclave's shoreline never lived up to expectations. Since the pier opened on the 17th of May, it was destroyed on a number of occasions by inclement weather. Volumes of assistance which managed to get through it were insignificant. It's not clear will the pier be rebuilt following the latest destruction. Its construction and operation cost hundreds of millions of dollars. The way we see it, instead of building the pier, Washington could have demanded that Israel ease the blockade on Gaza and allowed the entry of truly substantial aid volumes. We deem that continuing to bet on the maritime route, portraying this route as one of, if not the most important artery for assisting the Palestinians, is wishful thinking. On our side, we'll continue to providing all aid that we can to the Palestinians. Since the very outset, airplanes of the Ministry of Emergency Situations of Russia sent to Arish, a city in Egypt on the border, for on-shipment to the besieged Palestinian enclave over 500 tons of humanitarian assistance via the Egyptian Red Crescent Society. The latest round of deliveries occurred on the 19th of June. In addition to government bodies, Russian NGOs and civil society organizations are actively involved in collecting assistance for Palestinians in need. There are also private individuals. And thanks to all of their efforts across Russia, hundreds of tons of medicines, warm clothes, tents, foodstuffs, and other essentials were collected and sent to the Gaza Strip for subsequent distribution to Gazans. Colleagues, we stand convinced that given the unabating escalation of violence in the Palestine-Israeli conflict zone, the UN Security Council must continue to exert pressure on Israel and its US ally to establish an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire. That is the only way to establish the conditions for switching the settlement to a political and diplomatic track. This requires, first and foremost, direct dialogue to be established between Israelis and Palestinians across the whole range of final status issues. The outcome of this process should be the implementation of a formula that's been approved by the international community, the two-state formula, Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security within the borders of 1967. I resume my function as President of the Security Council. There are no more names on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to continue our discussion of the subject in informal consultations. The meeting stands adjourned.